I knew Mason Reed was going to be a problem before we finished loading the van. He had been my delivery partner for exactly 23 minutes, and he had already reorganized 3 shelves I had arranged perfectly well on my own. "You always load like this?" he asked. I scanned another package. "Like what?" "Like you're preparing evidence for a trial. I like knowing where things are. I like delivering them." I looked over at him. Mason grinned, completely unbothered. Our dispatcher had called the pairing temporary. Mason's usual route was being reorganized, and mine needed a second driver for the week. I preferred working alone, but if I had to share a van, I could survive someone who thought organization was a personality defect. Unfortunately, Mason was good. By our 4th stop, he'd figured out my system despite pretending not to respect it. By our 7th, we were moving fast enough that I almost stopped being annoyed with him. Almost. Near noon, we pulled up outside a print shop I delivered to for months. I carried 2 boxes inside while Mason brought the remaining package behind me. "There's my favorite delivery guy," Eric called from behind the counter. "I'm your only delivery guy. That doesn't make you less special." I laughed and set the boxes down. Eric leaned against the counter while I scanned the delivery. "You disappear on me last week? Different route." I was devastated. "Somehow you survived." "Barely." His eyes moved toward Mason, then back to me. "You should make it up to me." Before I could answer, Mason stepped beside me. "We've got 9 stops before lunch." His tone wasn't rude exactly. It was just sharp enough to change the temperature. Eric raised an eyebrow. "New partner." "Temporary," I said. Mason picked up my scanner from the counter and held it toward me. "Signature done?" I took it from him. "Yes, boss." Eric laughed. Mason didn't. Back in the van, he shut his door harder than necessary. I started the engine. "You know we're ahead of schedule, right? We won't stay ahead if every customer gets a 10-minute conversation." That was maybe 2 minutes. Felt longer. I glanced at him. Mason stared through the windshield. There was something strangely satisfying about watching a man who had spent the entire morning acting impossible suddenly pretend he wasn't irritated. "You don't like Eric?" "I don't know Eric." "You seem to have an opinion." "I have an opinion about standing around while somebody flirts instead of working." I stopped with my hand on the gearshift. "Flirts?" Mason finally looked at me. "You didn't notice?" I smiled despite myself. "Apparently you did." His expression tightened for half a second. Then he reached behind his seat for the next package. "What's the next address?" I gave it to him, but he wasn't getting away that easily. "So," I said as we pulled into traffic, "does he always talk to me like what?" Mason turned toward me. "What?" "You said he was flirting. I'm curious what gave him away." "Everything." "That specific?" "He called you his favorite delivery guy. As established, I'm his only delivery guy. He asked you to make something up to him. Maybe he's deeply passionate about reliable shipping." Mason gave me a look. I laughed. For the next several stops, we settled back into work. Mason became efficient again, passing me packages before I asked and calling out apartment numbers while I scanned labels. If anything, we worked better after arguing. But the question stayed with me. Not whether Eric had been flirting. I knew Eric well enough to recognize harmless attention. What bothered me was how quickly Mason had recognized it, and how much he'd seemed to hate it. At our next red light, Mason tapped his fingers against his knee before asking, far too casually, "You know that guy outside work?" I turned my head. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. "No." Mason nodded once. The light changed. He said nothing else, and neither did I. But 23 minutes into our partnership, I thought Mason's biggest problem was that he wanted control of my delivery van. By lunchtime, I was starting to wonder why he seemed even more interested in who wanted my attention. By Tuesday morning, Mason had apparently decided my loading system was no longer ridiculous. He still refused to admit it. "You put the apartment deliveries on the left. Because we hit them before noon," he said, sliding 3 packages into exactly the correct position. I looked up from my scanner. "Careful. You're starting to sound organized." I'm adapting to difficult working conditions. Brave of you. He smirked and shut the rear doors. That became our rhythm for the morning. Mason complained about my system while following it perfectly. I told him he drove like every yellow light had personally insulted him. He accused me of taking too long checking addresses, then somehow had the next package ready every time I opened the side door. By 10, we were ahead again. At our usual break, I headed toward the convenience store beside the gas station while Mason stayed by the van to answer a message. I had barely reached the door when he called my name. I turned. He held out a cold bottle of unsweetened iced tea. I stared at it. What? Nothing. You're looking at the bottle like it's dangerous. I was wondering why you bought this. Because you drink it. That made me pause. I'd bought the same tea the day before, but I hadn't remembered Mason noticing. You memorize everyone's drinks after one shift? No, only the annoying ones. That's almost sweet. Don't ruin it. I took the bottle, smiling as I walked back toward the van. The strange thing about Mason was that moments like that kept appearing between arguments. He could spend 5 minutes criticizing how I stacked packages, then quietly take the heavier half of a load without mentioning it. He remembered which apartment buildings I preferred handling because I knew the managers. He stopped questioning my route order once he realized it worked. And increasingly, he seemed to know what I needed before I asked. Our afternoon deliveries took us through a row of medical offices. At the third building, I carried a padded envelope inside while Mason followed with a small box. The receptionist checked the label, then looked at me. You're back. I keep getting sent here. I'm not complaining. I laughed. Good to know. He signed the scanner and handed it back, but didn't release it immediately. You always this cheerful halfway through a delivery shift? Only when people sign without making me chase them. So that's all it takes to impress you? Before I could answer, Mason appeared beside my shoulder. We're good. The receptionist released the scanner. All yours. Mason took the box from the counter even though it was already delivered. I looked at him. What are you doing? Leaving. We just got here. And now we're done. Outside, I waited until we reached the van before saying, You did it again. Mason opened the passenger door. Did what? That thing. What thing? The suddenly we're in a huge hurry thing. We have deliveries. We're 14 minutes ahead. He climbed inside. You're keeping track now? I always keep track. Of course you do. I got behind the wheel but didn't start the engine. Mason looked at me. You want to handle this stop next time? I asked. Sure. Why? He shrugged. I'm faster. I laughed. You're unbelievable. What? You practically climbed between me and that guy. I picked up a box. A delivered box. He glanced down at it, apparently realizing he was still holding it. I held out my hand. Mason gave me the box without comment. Bodyguard, I said. Please. Territorial bodyguard? Drive, Brooks. I started the van, still laughing. For several blocks, Mason watched traffic with exaggerated concentration. Then he reached forward and adjusted the air vent. You know, he said. Some people flirt because they think delivery guys won't be back often enough for it to get awkward. I glanced at him. You've developed a whole theory? Observation. Of my customers? Of people. Right? He went quiet. I let him. The teasing was fun, but something underneath it had begun to feel less accidental. Mason wasn't impatient when older customers wanted help moving packages inside. He wasn't annoyed when receptionists needed extra time finding signatures. He wasn't even particularly strict about our schedule unless a man seemed interested in me. That was harder to explain. A few stops later, Mason handed me a package before I could read the shelf label. 3rd floor, he said. You like taking this building because the elevator actually works. I stopped. How do you know that? You said it. When? He hesitated just long enough for me to notice. Yesterday, probably. I couldn't remember saying it. Mason tapped the package against my chest. Go. We're working. I took it, but as I stepped out of the van, I looked back at him. He was already reaching for the next delivery. Maybe Mason was simply observant. Maybe he remembered more than I did. But by the end of our second day, I had two questions about my new partner. Why did he notice so much about me? And why did every man who noticed me seem to bother him? By Wednesday, I had stopped wondering whether Mason was observant. He was observant. The question was why his powers of observation seemed to become supernatural whenever another man talked to me. We were loading the last commercial packages when Tyler, one of the other couriers, rolled his cart past our van. "Brooks." I looked up. "Morning. A few of us are getting drinks after shift. You coming?" "Maybe." Tyler leaned against his cart. "That's not an answer. I'll see how destroyed my new partner leaves me." Behind me, a package landed on the shelf harder than necessary. Tyler glanced at Mason. Mason smiled without warmth. "We're doing fine." "So I've heard." Tyler looked back at me. "Come out. You haven't joined us in forever." "I'll think about it." "We've still got route paperwork after shift," Mason said. I turned. Tyler did too. "Okay," he said slowly. "I wasn't inviting you." Mason picked up another box. "Good." I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. Tyler gave me a look that clearly asked what his problem was, then pushed his cart away. The second he disappeared, I faced Mason. "Route paperwork? We have paperwork. We always have paperwork." "Exactly. And somehow I've still managed to have a social life." Mason shut the van doors. "Congratulations." I watched him walk toward the passenger side. This time, I didn't bother pretending I hadn't noticed. The route got ugly before noon. A commercial building had far more outgoing packages than expected, and my side of the load backed up while Mason was already clear. Normally, he would have enjoyed that. Instead, he looked at the stack beside me, then at his. "Scanner. You take the signatures. I'll move these. You're finished with your side." I noticed. "You could get ahead." He gave me an impatient look. "Aiden." It was the first time he'd used my first name. I stared at him for half a beat before handing over 2 boxes. We cleared the stop together. Mason lost whatever advantage he'd had in our unofficial competition, and he never mentioned it. That bothered me more than his jealousy did. Jealousy could still be ego, territoriality. Maybe Mason simply hated sharing attention. But helping me when he could have beaten me? That felt different. Near the end of the shift, I checked my phone while Mason finished scanning our returns. Tyler had sent the address for drinks. Mason noticed. Of course he did. "You going?" I slipped the phone into my pocket. "Maybe." He nodded. Then, after several seconds, "You like Tyler?" I looked at him. "Do you?" "That depends. Are you asking as my delivery partner or my bodyguard?" Mason rolled his eyes. "Forget it." "No, I'm interested now. I was making conversation. You looked happier carrying 40-pound boxes than you do making this conversation." He grabbed the paperwork from the dashboard. I leaned against the van. "You don't like him." "I don't care about him." "You didn't like Eric either." "I don't care about Eric." "The receptionist yesterday?" Mason's jaw tightened. I smiled. "Interesting pattern." "There is no pattern." "So you wouldn't care if I went out with Tyler tonight?" His eyes met mine. For 1 second, the answer was written all over his face. Then he looked away. "Do whatever you want." I should have let it go. Instead I said, "I probably will." Mason shoved the papers onto the dashboard. "Great. Great. Have fun." "I intend to." He started walking toward the depot. I called after him, "Mason." He stopped. "If you don't care, why are you angry?" He turned around. "I'm not angry. You're abusing paperwork." That almost made him smile, but the expression vanished. "I just don't trust guys who start distracting someone while they're working." "The shift is over." Silence. There it was. No schedule. No packages. No customer holding us up. Nothing professional. Left for him to hide behind. Mason looked toward the depot, then back at me. "Are you coming inside?" I laughed softly. "That's what I thought." He walked away before I could push further. I stayed beside the van for another moment, watching him go. 2 days earlier, I'd assumed Mason was territorial about his route. That explanation was dead now. He didn't care when customers slowed us down. He cared when men flirted with me. He didn't care about beating me enough to leave me struggling. But he apparently cared very much whether I spent Wednesday night with Tyler. I still didn't know what Mason wanted. I was beginning to suspect he didn't want me figuring it out either. Unfortunately for him, I was paying attention now. Thursday afternoon, I decided to stop guessing. If Mason wanted to insist there was no pattern, I was going to give him an opportunity to prove it. We were running another commercial route, and despite the tension we'd left at the depot Wednesday, we were working almost embarrassingly well together. Mason knew my system now. I knew when he was about to reach for a package before he moved. We barely needed to speak, which made it impossible not to notice when his entire mood changed. The stop was a small office I'd delivered to before. Daniel was at the front desk when I walked in with Mason carrying the second box behind me. Aiden. Hey. Daniel signed for the first package, then smiled. I was hoping you'd be back. Behind me, Mason became very quiet. I noticed. So this time, instead of steering the conversation back toward work, I waited. Daniel handed me the scanner. You seeing anyone? There wasn't much subtlety in that. I heard Mason set the box down. No, I said. Daniel's smile widened. Then maybe I can buy you coffee sometime. I could have answered immediately. Instead, I glanced at Mason. His expression was almost impressive. Not angry exactly. More like someone had handed him a problem he desperately wanted to solve but wasn't allowed to touch. Daniel followed my gaze. Am I interrupting something? No, Mason said, much too quickly. I looked back at Daniel. I'll think about the coffee. Good answer. Mason picked up the empty delivery tote. We need to go. Daniel looked amused now. Busy day. Very. We're ahead, I said. Mason stared at me. I smiled politely at Daniel. See you next time. Outside, Mason walked straight past the van and started rearranging the remaining packages. I leaned against the open door. What are you doing? Getting the next stops ready. They're already organized. Not well. That was almost insulting. You've been praising my system for 3 days. I have never praised your system. You've been secretly worshipping it. He grabbed 2 boxes. I took one from him. Mason. What? Why are you mad? I'm not. You keep saying that. Because you keep asking. You practically dragged me out of there. We have work. We're 17 minutes ahead. His jaw moved. I waited. Finally, he said, You don't have to encourage every guy who flirts with you. There it was. I straightened. Encourage. You knew what he was doing. So did you. He wasn't subtle. And why does that bother you? It doesn't. I laughed once. Mason shut the van door harder than necessary. What's funny? You. Glad I'm entertaining. You've done this all week. Done what? Eric talks to me, you suddenly care about the schedule. A receptionist compliments me, you volunteer to take the stop. Tyler asks me out for drinks, and you develop a passionate commitment to paperwork. Now Daniel asks me for coffee, and you're reorganizing packages that are already organized. Mason stared at me. I stepped closer, not enough to touch him, but enough that he couldn't pretend the conversation was casual. You keep telling me none of these guys matter to you. They don't. Then why does my dating life matter? It doesn't. Your face disagrees. Something flashed across his expression. For once, he didn't have a sarcastic answer ready. Traffic moved behind us. Somewhere across the parking lot, a cart rattled over pavement. Mason looked down at the package in his hands. I could have let him escape. Instead, I said, If I get coffee with Daniel, that's none of your business, right? His eyes came back to mine. Right? The word sounded forced. Okay. I reached for the package. He didn't release it immediately. For a second, we both had a hand on the same box. Then Mason let go. I carried it toward the front of the van. Behind me, he said, You're seriously considering it? I stopped. That was the answer I had been waiting for. I turned around. You just said it wasn't your business. It isn't. Then stop asking questions like it is. Mason opened his mouth. Nothing came out. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. A moment later, he got in beside me. Neither of us spoke for the first few blocks. The silence wasn't comfortable anymore. It wasn't hostile either. It felt like something stretched too tightly between us, waiting for one of us to pull hard enough to break it. At the next light, I glanced at Mason. He was staring out the passenger window. For 3 days, he'd been able to hide behind schedules, customers, paperwork, and packages. I'd finally removed every excuse. And Mason still couldn't tell me why the possibility of another man taking me for coffee bothered him so much. The difference was that now he knew I wasn't going to stop noticing. The message arrived before we finished Thursday's route. I was standing beside the van checking the last few addresses when my phone buzzed. Daniel, coffee offer still stands. No delivery required. I smiled despite myself. From the other side of the van, Mason said, "What?" I looked up. What? You smiled. People do that. Not at route manifests. I slipped my phone into my pocket. Mason watched the movement. Is that him? I stared at him. He immediately looked down at the package in his hands. I almost laughed, but after our argument earlier, it wasn't funny anymore. You mean Daniel? Mason shrugged. You know exactly who I mean. Yes, I said. It's Daniel. His fingers tightened around the box. What did he want? I closed the van door. Mason. What? You can't keep doing this. Doing what? I stepped around the van until we were facing each other. This, questioning me every time another man talks to me, getting irritated, interrupting conversations, acting like my phone is suddenly part of your delivery responsibilities. I asked one question. No. You've been asking the same question all week in different ways. He looked away. I continued before he could retreat into another excuse. Eric, the receptionist. Tyler. Daniel. Every single time a man shows interest in me, you change. That's ridiculous. Is it? Yes. Then tell me why you asked if Daniel texted me. Mason said nothing. Tell me why you cared whether I went out with Tyler. We work together. That explains paperwork. It doesn't explain jealousy. His eyes snapped back to mine. I'm not jealous. There it was again. The denial sounded weaker every time he used it. I folded my arms. Okay. Then stop. His expression shifted. Stop what? Stop questioning who I talk to. Stop stepping between me and men who flirt with me. Stop acting angry when someone asks me out. If it isn't jealousy and it isn't personal, then there's no reason for you to care. Mason stared at me. For once, I wasn't teasing him. I wanted an answer. If I get coffee with Daniel, I said, you don't get to make me feel like I've done something wrong. I never said you did. You don't have to. His jaw tightened. A truck passed at the end of the lot, briefly filling the silence between us. Then Mason asked quietly, Are you going? I exhaled. That is exactly what I'm talking about. I know. The words stopped me. Mason put the package down inside the van. He rubbed a hand across the back of his neck, suddenly looking less like the man who always had a comeback and more like someone who had run out of places to hide. I know, he repeated. I waited. He looked at me. I don't like it. My pulse kicked harder. Don't like what? When those guys talk to you like that. Why? Mason shook his head. No, you don't get to stop there. I don't know what you want me to say. The truth would be interesting. He let out a humorless laugh. The truth is I see somebody flirting with you and it bothers me. Everything inside me went still. For 4 days I'd been collecting evidence. Now he'd finally admitted the part one could already see. So you are jealous. Mason looked toward the van. I didn't say that. You just described jealousy. Fine. Fine what? His eyes met mine again. Fine. Maybe I'm jealous. The satisfaction I expected never came. Instead, a bigger question opened immediately. Why? Mason's face closed. I felt it happen before he spoke. Aiden. No. That's the part that matters. I said I don't know. You know enough to get angry. I know it bothers me. But you don't know why? He looked frustrated now, but not with me. I don't know what it means. That answer landed differently. Not denial exactly. Fear. I lowered my voice. Then figure it out. Mason stared at me for a long moment. What about Daniel? I almost smiled. Even now, I haven't answered him. Something in Mason's shoulders loosened before he could stop it. I noticed. Of course I noticed. Then I shook my head. Don't look relieved. This doesn't mean you get to keep doing this. I know. If you don't want me dating someone else, eventually you're going to have to tell me what you do want. He didn't answer. We finished the route differently after that. No jokes. No fake arguments about package order. No pretending the tension between us belonged to the job. But we still moved together almost automatically. Mason passed me the right packages. I knew when he needed the scanner. We finished ahead of schedule without discussing how. At the depot, I reached for the door. Aiden. I looked back. Mason seemed about to say something. Then he shook his head. See you tomorrow. Yeah. I climbed out. For most of the week, I'd been trying to answer one question. Was Mason jealous? Now I knew. He was. But walking away from the van, I realized that had been the easy question. The one that mattered was whether Mason wanted me badly enough to stop hiding behind everything he couldn't explain. Friday morning, Mason didn't touch my loading system. No criticism. No rearranging. Not even a sarcastic comment about my labels. That was worse. We loaded the van in near silence, and once we started the route, Mason seemed determined to prove he could give me exactly what I'd asked for. Space. He didn't ask about Daniel. He didn't react when anyone talked to me. He didn't tease me when I double-checked an address. For 4 days, I'd thought Mason's attention was the problem. By our third stop, I realized his withdrawal bothered me more. We were still good together. Maybe better than good. I reached for the scanner and Mason already had it waiting. He pulled the correct package before I called the number. At one building, we split a stack without discussing who would take what. Everything worked. Nothing felt normal. Near midday, I finally said, "This is weird." Mason kept sorting packages. "What's weird?" "You. Helpful. You haven't argued with me in 3 hours. You told me to stop bothering you. I told you to stop acting jealous while pretending it meant nothing." He froze for half a second. Then he put another package on the shelf. "I'm trying. To do what?" "I don't know, Aiden. Give you space." I leaned against the van door. The answer should have satisfied me. Didn't. My eyes fell on the package he'd already pulled for our next stop. "You knew I'd take this one. You usually do." That brought Tuesday back to me. The iced tea. The apartment building. The route schedule he'd known too well. I looked at him. "Mason, how did you know about my old route?" His expression changed. "What?" "You knew which days I used to work this area. You knew things about my stops before we'd been partnered long enough for me to tell you. I pay attention." That explanation worked Tuesday. He looked away. "It doesn't anymore." Silence filled the back of the van. I waited. Finally, Mason exhaled. "I'd seen you before." I straightened. "Before Monday?" "Yes." "How many times?" "A few." His reluctance told me it was more than a few. "Where?" "Depot. Overlapping routes. Sometimes we'd be loading around the same time." I searched my memory and found fragments of him there. Someone passing between vans. A familiar face I hadn't bothered attaching a name to. "You remembered my schedule?" Mason rubbed his palm over his jaw. "Some of it." "Why?" He gave me a look that almost said, "Please don't make me answer." I didn't rescue him. "Mason, because I noticed you." The words were quiet. I felt my heartbeat change. He continued before I could speak. "You always loaded the same way, bought the same tea, took certain routes, whenever they were available. And you remembered all that?" "Yes." "Why?" He laughed once, embarrassed rather than amused. "You really need me to say it?" "Yes." Mason looked directly at me. Because I was interested in you. There it was. Not this week. Before this week. I thought about every argument we'd had since Monday, and suddenly pieces shifted into different positions. When they assigned us together, I was hoping they would. I stared at him. You wanted this? I wanted a reason to talk to you. And your strategy was criticizing my package organization? A reluctant smile appeared. I didn't say it was a good strategy. Despite everything, I laughed. Mason did too, and for a few seconds the tension loosened. Then the real problem returned. You were interested before we became partners, I said. You're jealous when other guys talk to me. You admitted seeing me with someone else bothers you. His smile disappeared. Yes. Then why are we still pretending you don't know what you want? Mason looked down. That hurt more than I expected. I can tell you what I've felt, he said. I can't tell you I'm ready to turn it into something I don't know how to handle. I nodded slowly. At least it was honest. But honesty didn't make it enough. We should finish the route. Aiden, we're working. The phrase sounded different coming from me now. Mason didn't argue. We went back to the deliveries. But nothing could return to what it had been Thursday morning. I had finally learned why Mason noticed so much. He hadn't become interested because we were trapped in a van together. He'd wanted to be beside me before either of us had loaded the first package. And somehow that made his hesitation worse. Because Mason wasn't confused about whether he wanted me. He was afraid of what choosing me would require. We finished Friday's route with almost 20 minutes to spare. A week earlier, that would have felt like a victory. Instead, Mason parked at the depot, shut off the engine, and neither of us moved. We should unload, he said. Probably. We worked through the returns in silence. The strange thing was how easy the physical part had become. Mason handed me packages without checking labels twice. I knew which paperwork he would reach for. We moved around each other without getting in each other's way. We had become exactly the kind of delivery team I would normally fight to keep. That was why the conversation inside the depot hit harder than it should have. Our temporary pairing was ending after our next scheduled run. The route adjustment was almost finished, and I could return to a stable arrangement instead of requesting to stay paired with Mason. I found him beside the van afterward. So that's it, I said. He knew what I meant. Looks like it. I waited. Mason shoved his hands into his pockets. We knew it might only be temporary. Something inside me went cold. Right? Aiden. No. You're right. His expression tightened. I continued. I'll take the stable route. Mason stared at me. You already decided? I just did. You don't have to. Why wouldn't I? He looked away. There it was again. He wanted me to stay, but apparently even now I had to drag the reason out of him. I was tired of doing that. You wanted us paired before I even knew your name, I said. You remembered my schedule. You noticed what I drank. You get jealous every time another man looks at me for more than 5 seconds. Mason's jaw tightened. And somehow, I continued. When you actually have to decide whether you want this partnership to continue, all you've got is we knew it was temporary. I told you I'm trying to figure this out. And I'm telling you I'm not waiting inside the question while you do. He went still. I hadn't planned the words, but once I said them, I knew they were true. I like you, Mason. His eyes lifted to mine. That isn't the problem. Then what is? You want me close enough that nobody else gets comfortable around me. You want to know who texts me. You wanted a reason to spend every day beside me before we were even assigned together. I stepped closer. But when I ask what you want from me, suddenly none of it has a name. His voice dropped. You think this is easy for me? No, that seemed to surprise him. I think it's difficult, I said. I also think difficult doesn't mean I have to accept half of something. Mason looked toward the depot doors. After a moment, he asked, Is this because you're going to get coffee with Daniel? I almost couldn't believe it. No, but you might. This is not about Daniel. Or Tyler. I shook my head. Listen to yourself. Mason fell silent. You keep acting like the danger is some other guy taking me away from you, I said. There is no way, Mason. You haven't chosen anything for me to leave. That landed. I saw it in his face. I softened, but I didn't take it back. If you don't want a relationship with me, that's okay. You don't owe me one. But then you don't get to treat every man who might want one like he's trespassing. Mason swallowed. And if you do want one? He waited. Then eventually you have to choose it. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally Mason said, "So you're leaving the partnership?" "After our last run, yes." He nodded once. This time he didn't argue. Maybe part of me had expected him to stop me immediately. Maybe that was unfair after everything he'd admitted. But I couldn't make the decision for him. I picked up my bag. "See you for the last route." "Aiden." I turned. Mason looked like he had a dozen things he wanted to say. None of them came. "Yeah," I said quietly. Then I walked away. For most of the week, Mason had acted like the threat was every man who looked at me. He'd been wrong. Eric wasn't going to cost him anything. Neither were Tyler or Daniel. If Mason lost me, it wouldn't be because someone else had gotten there first. It would be because, when the moment came to choose me, he'd decided that saying nothing was safer. Our last route started without an argument. That should have felt peaceful. Instead, every quiet mile reminded me that, by the end of the shift, Mason and I would no longer have a reason to sit beside each other. We loaded the van the way we'd learned to do it together. I scanned while Mason sorted. He didn't mock my system. I didn't complain when he shifted 2 packages because he knew we'd reach them sooner from his side. At the first few stops, we barely needed words. 3rd floor. "I've got it. 2 signatures. Scanners here." By midday, the efficiency that had annoyed me on Friday felt almost cruel. We were good at this, not because we'd been forced into the same van long enough to tolerate each other, but because somewhere between Mason criticizing my shelves and memorizing the way I worked, we'd learned each other. And now we were finishing. Neither of us mentioned it. When the final package left the van, Mason looked at the empty shelf for a second longer than necessary. "That was it," he said. "Yeah." The drive back to the depot was quiet. I had already made my decision. I wasn't going to ask again. Mason knew I liked him. He knew why I was leaving the partnership. If he wanted something different, the next move had to belong to him. We parked. I collected my bag while Mason gathered the paperwork. "Guess I'll see you around," I said. His hand stopped. I waited. Mason looked at me, then toward the depot. For one terrible second, I thought he was going to nod and let me leave. Instead, he dropped the paperwork onto the seat. "No," I frowned. "No, don't do that." "Do what?" "Say it like we're just going to wave at each other across the depot after this." My pulse accelerated. "Mason, that was your choice." "I know." He stepped out of the van. I followed. He stood beside the open passenger door, visibly trying to assemble words he'd spent an entire week avoiding. "I could let you take the other arrangement," he said. "I could tell myself this was temporary and go back to whatever I was doing before." "You could." "I don't want to." I said nothing. He had to finish this himself. Mason exhaled. "I noticed you before we were partners because I liked you. I wanted us assigned together because it gave me an excuse to be around you without having to admit that." His eyes stayed on mine. "And when those guys flirted with you, I kept pretending I was irritated about the route because that was easier than admitting I wanted them to stop." My throat tightened. "I was jealous." "You already admitted that." "I know. I'm admitting why." That silenced me. Mason stepped closer, still leaving space between us. "I wanted your attention on me." There was no schedule excuse now. No paperwork. No packages. Just Mason. "I kept thinking if I didn't define it, I couldn't screw it up," he said. "I could have you beside me every day and never risk finding out you didn't want the same thing. And then I left anyway." "Exactly." A small, nervous laugh escaped him. "You were right. I was trying to keep all the parts one wanted without choosing anything." He swallowed. "So I'm choosing." My heartbeat was loud enough that I was sure he could hear it. "What are you choosing?" "You." The word came without hesitation. Mason looked terrified after saying it. That mattered more than if he'd looked confident. I want to take you out, he said. Not because we're partners. Not because somebody else asked first. An actual date. With me. And if I say no, then I'll deal with it. And work will probably be awkward. I smiled despite myself. Probably. Extremely. He smiled too but didn't retreat. That doesn't change what I'm asking. For the first time all week, Mason wasn't trying to control the answer. He was risking one. Yes, I said. His expression changed completely. Yes. I'll go on a date with you. Mason laughed under his breath. Okay. Very smooth. I've had a difficult week. You created most of it. Also true. We stood there smiling at each other, and suddenly the distance between us felt ridiculous. Mason's eyes dropped briefly to my mouth before returning to mine. He didn't move. I did. I caught the front of his jacket and pulled him toward me. The kiss was brief at first, almost cautious. Then Mason kissed me back. Nothing about it felt confused. When we separated, his forehead rested lightly against mine. So, I murmured, still worried about Daniel? Mason closed his eyes. Aiden. I laughed. He did too. The jealousy hadn't disappeared. Neither had the uncertainty of whatever came next. But the excuse was gone. Mason had finally done the one thing he'd avoided from the moment we met. He'd stopped hiding behind being my delivery partner and chosen to become something else. A week later, Mason was no longer my new delivery partner. He was the man I'd gone on 2 dates with, kissed more than once, and discovered was considerably less confident when there wasn't a package scanner available to distract him. Work hadn't changed as dramatically as I'd expected. The depot was still noisy in the morning. Routes still needed loading. Customers still forgot they had to sign for things. But Mason had changed one important habit. He stopped pretending. We were making a delivery together when I walked into a familiar business with Mason behind me carrying the second package. The man at the counter smiled when he saw me. Good. They sent the friendly one. I set the package down. Don't say that too loudly. My reputation will suffer. He laughed as he signed the scanner. You always working this area? Depends on the week. That's unfortunate. I was hoping I'd have an excuse to see you again. I heard Mason shift behind me. There it was. I knew that silence now. I finished the delivery and turned toward him. Mason was holding the second package against his chest, his expression carefully neutral. I raised an eyebrow. He knew exactly what I was asking. For half a second, I could almost see the old excuses lining up. We're behind schedule. We have another stop. He's distracting you. Instead, Mason sighed. Yeah, he said. I'm jealous. The customer looked between us. I smiled. See? Growth. Don't make me regret honesty. Never. Mason shook his head, but he was smiling when we walked outside. There was no sudden rush to get me into the van. No interrogation about whether I knew the guy. No invented professional emergency. Just the truth. We climbed into the van, and Mason handed me the scanner before I asked for it. You know, I said, you're much easier to work with now. That's funny. I was about to say the opposite. You wanted this. I did. You memorized my schedule. I admitted that under emotional distress. You knew my drink. A devastating mistake. You reorganized my packages. They needed help. I stared at him. Mason lasted 3 seconds before laughing. Then his expression softened. I did want this, he said. The joke left my face. I knew he wasn't talking about the route. I reached across the space between our seats and squeezed his hand once. So did I. Then I let go and started the engine. We still had deliveries to make. Mason still noticed when men looked at me. I still noticed him noticing. The difference was that I no longer had to wonder what his jealousy meant, and Mason no longer needed a schedule, a package, or a delivery route to explain it away. The first day we'd worked together, I'd thought he wanted control of my van. By the end of the week, I'd learned he'd wanted my attention. Now, whenever that familiar jealous look crossed his face, he didn't hide it. He just looked at me like a man who had finally chosen what he wanted, and knew I had chosen him back.